Welcome back to the Kingdom Planning Podcast. In our first conversation, we talked about the signals that organizations produce when strain is forming beneath the surface, the repeated friction, the decision bottlenecks, the knowledge that lives in a few people's heads instead of the structure itself. Today, I want to go a level deeper because understanding that strain is forming is one thing. Understanding what is generating it and how it attaches itself to the leader personally is something completely different. This episode is about leadership load, what it is, how it grows without anyone planning it, and why it so often goes unrecognized until it has already changed the way a leader leads. And I want to start with something a lot of leaders carry quietly but rarely name. If someone asked you how much you were carrying right now, your first instinct would probably be to describe your schedule. Meetings, sermons, staff conversations, events coming up, the list in your head of things that need attention before the end of the week. That's a reasonable answer, but it is also incomplete. Because some of the heaviest weight leaders carry doesn't appear on the calendar at all. There is the personnel situation you have been mentally rehearsing for 2 weeks, even though the actual conversation itself has not happened yet. There is the congregational tension you are holding carefully, aware that how you navigate the next few weeks will matter for years. There is the institutional memory that you carry because you have been here longer than almost anyone else, and you are the one who remembers why certain decisions were made and what the cost was. None of these things appear on the schedule, but they are present every day. They occupy attention, they shape how energy is spent, and over time they accumulate in ways that are very difficult to see clearly from the outside. Leadership load is more than visible activity. It includes the weight of what leaders hold relationally, cognitively, and emotionally, even when nothing measurable is being produced. And one of the defining features of that invisible load is this: it doesn't stop when the workday ends. Most leaders do not accumulate unsustainable load because they made a bad choice. It accumulates because they made a lot of reasonable choices in a row. Think about how it typically unfolds. As staff transition happens, no one is available to cover a particular function immediately, so the senior leader steps in temporarily. Then the situation stabilizes. Time passes. The function never gets formally reassigned because the senior leader is already doing it and the team has adapted. What began as temporary bridge quietly becomes a permanent expectation. Or the organization grows. Attendance increases, new families arrive, the coordination needs multiplied. Communication becomes more complex. The leader absorbs the additional relational and operational demands personally because no structure was redesigned to handle the growth. Capacity drift becomes, as it often does, the hidden cost of success. Each of these adjustments made sense in the moment. Each reflected genuine responsiveness to real need, but each one also narrowed the margin available for the kind of leadership that requires unhurried attention. There is a pattern worth naming here. Responsibility tends to migrate toward the most capable and trusted individuals in any system, and the structures actively guide distribution. In ministry and nonprofit environments, this migration is especially common. Leaders are motivated by calling rather than convenience. Saying yes to a need feels like faithfulness. Caring more feels like sacrifice, and sacrifice is a value and a virtue. But over time, what feels like virtue is quietly changing the shape of your leadership. And by the time leaders notice, the structure around them has already adapted to depend on what they are personally providing. Capacity drift has a particular texture. It arrives as an obvious crisis not that often. Instead, it arrives as a collection of experiences that feel individually manageable but collectively significant. One is the inability to fully disengage. Leaders describe taking time away and still being present to the organization. Vacation that includes email. Rest that is never complete because unresolved responsibilities remain centralized. Time away that still involves decisions moving upward because no one has authority to make them in the senior leader's absence. This experience is often interpreted as personal dedication, but it usually is a structural signal. True absence becomes difficult not because leaders lack discipline, but because the system depends too heavily on their continual presence. The second experience is the quiet disappearance of reflection time. Leaders who once spent time thinking about direction find themselves increasingly in response mode. Strategic conversations get postponed because immediate operational needs take priority. The long view narrows. The vision becomes shorter term, not because foresight has diminished, but because the margin required for that kind of thinking has been consumed entirely. A third is what I would describe as recovery that doesn't recover. Rest helps, but only briefly. Leaders return from a weekend or a retreat feeling better, and within a few days, the pressure returns. They often interpret this as a resilience problem, or a spiritual problem, or simply the cost of the calling. Sometimes it is, but often it is a structural problem. Increased rest cannot resolve strain that is being generated structurally. The conditions that produce the exhaustion remain in place, and no amount of personal renewal will remove them. Luke 5:16 tells us, "But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer." This is worth noticing. Jesus withdrew consistently, not occasionally, and his withdrawal was not simply personal restoration. It was a pattern he returned to amid sustained and significant demand. Withdrawal in Scripture reflects wisdom rather than retreat. It is the discipline of a leader who understood that clarity requires margin and that margin must be protected rather than spent. One of the more subtle effects of accumulated load is something I call decision saturation. It is not exhaustion in the traditional sense. Leaders experiencing decision saturation often appear to be functioning well. They are still very present. They are still very engaged. They are still making decisions. What has changed is the effort required. Decisions arrive continuously across unrelated areas. A facilities question, a pastoral situation, a programming gap, a personnel dynamic, a budget concern. Each one requires context, relational awareness, and judgment. None of them are extraordinary individually, but collectively they consume cognitive energy at a rate that the visible workload does not fully account for. Over time, the quality of later decisions in a day or a week tends to shift. Not because wisdom has declined, but because available attention has already been allocated. Early decisions receive careful consideration. Later ones get handled more quickly, under more pressure, with less reflection. And this is where something important gets lost. Strategic thinking requires our particular kind of uninterrupted attention, the kind that gets used up first when decision saturation is present. Vision becomes shorter and more reactive, not because leaders lack the capacity to think long term, but because the cognitive space required for long term thinking is consistently occupied by immediate operational demands. This matters organizationally because direction begins to feel incremental, not chosen intentionally, but produced by whoever showed up in the leader's calendar that week. And few people inside the system ever name what is actually happening. Ministry leadership is relational work at its core. That is one of its gifts. Leaders in church and nonprofit environments genuinely care about the people that they serve. The work is not transactional. There is real investment, real relationship, and real emotional presence involved. But that relational depth also produces a particular kind of load that is easy to underestimate. Pastoral concerns do not include when conversations end. Staff tensions remain emotionally active long after a meeting closes. A family in crisis, a difficult volunteer relationship, a season of congregational conflict, these things carry forward internally in ways that consume attention and emotional energy continuously, not only during scheduled interactions. This relational carryover is not a weakness. It reflects genuine care, but it does accumulate. Leaders operating under sustained relational load often notice that they are less emotionally available over time, not because they care less, but because emotional capacity has been exceeded. Conversations that once felt energizing begin requiring more effort. Listening becomes more difficult and patience narrows. This is rarely a personal failing. It is almost always a structural sign. When relational responsibility concentrates in a few central roles rather than being distributed across a healthy team, the emotional demand on those roles eventually exceeds what sustained leadership can absorb without cost. And because emotional load is invisible, it is the last place most organizations look when they are trying to understand why a leader seems different than they used to be. Here is what I find most worth paying attention to in all of this. Accumulated load does not only exhaust leaders, it gradually reshapes how they lead. And that reshaping happens quietly. No leader decides to become reactive. No one chooses to stop thinking long term. No one intentionally becomes less available to their team, but structural accumulation eventually produces those outcomes anyway, not through intention, but through sustained pressure on margin that was never restored. Time that was once spent in reflection becomes time spent in response. Conversations that once unfolded with patience begin happening under time pressure. Listening shortens, curiosity narrows. The leader who once had the capacity to sit with complexity and hold tension well begins moving decisions more quickly simply because the pace of demand has exceeded the pace of reflection. Teams notice this, even when they cannot name it. Interactions feel different. The leader is still present, still committed, but something has shifted. Culture begins to mirror the pressure at the top. Urgency replaces steadiness. Speed begins driving decisions more than clarity does. One of the most consequential effects is what this does to early problem detection. When margin narrows, attention naturally moves toward what is most immediate. The pattern recognition that healthy leadership depends on noticing the early signal before it becomes the visible crisis requires observational space that sustained lead load systematically consumes. Leaders operating without margin do not inherit problems because their judgment is poor. They inherit them later in the development cycle because structural pressure reduced their ability to see what was forming early enough to respond thoughtfully. Before I move toward the close, I want to offer a question that I think is worth sitting with honestly. If you or the senior leaders in your organization stepped away for an extended period of time, which responsibilities would continue smoothly and which would stall? That question is worth answering carefully and honestly, not because absence is coming, but because what the honest answer reveals tells you something important about how structural dependency has formed around key individuals. If much of what you identified would stall, that does not signal failure. It often signals success that has outgrown the structure built to support it. Organizations grow, demands multiply, and structure that was appropriate for an earlier season quietly becomes insufficient without anyone designing that outcome. Capacity drift rarely announces itself. It accumulates in the background while the visible indicators of health remain intact. Faithful service continues. The mission advances, and the cost of being paid to sustain that progress remains invisible until it becomes impossible to ignore. Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not get tired of doing what is good." Endurance and good work requires sustainability. And sustainability is not simply a matter of personal resilience or spiritual discipline, it is also a matter of structure. Leaders who carry more than the structure was designed to support are not failing. They are often the most faithful people in the room. But faithfulness over the long term requires honest attention to what the structure around leadership is actually asking of the people within it. If some of what we covered today felt familiar, I want to name something. Recognition matters. Not because recognition alone changes anything, but because many leaders carry these experiences without a framework that helps them locate what they are sensing. They know something feels heavier than it should. They know recovery is not quite restoring what it used to restore, but without language for what is actually happening structurally, the experience tends to get turned inward. It becomes a personal resilience question rather than a structural one. What I hope this conversation offered is a different frame. The weight leaders carry is real, but much of its source is structural, and structure can be examined honestly. That's the kind of conversation kingdom planning exists to support, not from outside the reality of ministry leadership, but alongside it. If this conversation was useful, here are a few ways to go further. First, the Lead and Deliver newsletter goes deeper on topics like this on every issue, including practical observations in a book corner that connects organizational thinking to ministry and nonprofit leadership. You can subscribe at kingdomplanning.org/newsletter. Second, the Kingdom Planning Leadership Clarity Field Guide covers these patterns in structured detail across 5 modules. Module 1 addresses early organizational signals. This conversation was drawn from Module 2, which focuses specifically on leadership load and capacity drift. You can access both at kingdomplanning.org and click on the Resources tab, and they're all free. Third, if something in today's episode prompted a more specific question about your own context, I would welcome a conversation. Kingdom Planning offers a free 20-minute leadership clarity consultation for church and nonprofit leaders. It's just a focused conversation about what you are actually navigating. You can schedule that at kingdomplanning.org. Click on contact. Thank you for listening to the Kingdom Planning Podcast. And please remember, take time for yourself to step back so you can see clearly. Ask Father to help you lead courageously so that you can steward faithfully under His authority. Stay blessed, and we'll see you next time.